Chapter 1, Brother, I'm Dying. Part 1, He is my brother. This is how you can show your love to me. Everywhere we go, say of me, He is my brother. That's from Genesis 20:13. Chapter 1, Have you enjoyed your life? I found out I was pregnant the same day that my father's rapid weight loss and chronic shortness of breath were positively diagnosed as end-stage pulmonary fibrosis. It was a hot morning in early July 2004. I took a 6:30 a.m. flight from Miami to accompany my father on a visit to a pulmonologist at Brooklyn's Coney Island Hospital that afternoon. I'd planned to catch up on my sleep during the flight, but cramping in my lower abdomen kept me awake. I interpreted the cramps as a sign of worry for my father. In the past few months, his breathing had grown labored and loud, and he had been hospitalized 3 times. During his most recent hospital stay, he had been referred to a pulmonologist who'd since performed a new battery of tests. My father picked me up at the airport at 9 a.m. We hadn't seen each other in a month. 2 years before, in August 2002, I had married and moved to Miami, where my then-fiancée was living. Fearing my father's disapproval, I hadn't announced my intention to leave New York until a month before the wedding, when my father summoned me to his room for a chat. "How can you leave New York?" he asked while filling out a check on top of a book on his lap. Back then he was still healthy, yet lanky, with a body that looked and moved like an aging dancer's, a receding hairline, and half a head of salt and pepper hair. Removing his steel-rimmed bifocals so I could better see his amber eyes, he had added in his slow, scratchy voice, "Your mother's here in Brooklyn. I'm here. 2 of your 3 brothers are here. You have no family in Miami. What if this man you're moving there for mistreats you? Who are you going to turn to?" The lecture ended with his handing me the equivalent of 5 months of his mortgage payments toward the wedding reception costs. Looking back now, I wish he'd simply said, "Don't go. I'm going to get sick, and I might die." At the airport, my father was too weak to get out of the car to greet me. The blistering heat made his breathing even more difficult, he explained on his cell phone, while waving from the driver's seat of his apple-red Lincoln Town car, a car he used as both a gypsy cab and a family car. When we leaned over to open the door, he began to cough, a deep and hollow cough that produced a mouthful of thick phlegm, which he spat out in paper napkins piled up in a plastic bag next to him. During the 6 months that he'd been visibly sick, my father had grown ashamed of this cough, just as he'd been embarrassed about his arms and legs over the many years he'd battled chronic psoriasis and eczema. Then, too, he'd felt like a biblical leper, the kind people feared might infect them with skin-ravaging microbes and other ills. So whenever he coughed, he covered his entire face with both his hands. I waited for him to stop coughing, then leaned over and kissed him. The blunt edge of his high cheekbones struck my lips hard. He had taken to wearing a jacket even on the warmest days because he wanted to hide how much thinner he'd become. That morning at the airport he wore a gray sweater, a striped blue shirt, and navy pants that looked like they belonged to someone twice his size. "I'm happy to see you," he said, while tugging at his too-wide shirt collar. Merging into traffic at the airport exit, he asked about my husband and the house we'd been renovating in the Little Haiti section of Miami for the past 2 years. "Any new developments?" he winked. "Baby?" "Fero, my husband, and I were waiting to complete the renovations before trying to get pregnant," I told him. "You're 35 years old," he said. "You have more childbearing years behind you than you do ahead." Watching him effortlessly drive the same car he'd been driving for nearly a decade, I felt my stomach cramp again. We had a few hours still before his doctor's appointment, so he suggested we visit an herbalist that his pastor, a minister whose Pentecostal church my father had been attending for more than 30 years, had recently recommended. "Maybe the herbalist can examine us both," I suggested. At that point, I still wanted to believe that our discomforts might be comparable, something that a few herbs and aromatic plants could fix. The herbalist saw us immediately, even though we didn't have an appointment. A large Jamaican woman with a knit rainbow head wrap, she motioned my father to a chair next to a machine that looked like it was set up for an eye exam. Before iridology scans, she made us sign disclaimers saying we knew she wasn't a medical doctor and could not cure any illness. This, she explained, was a legal necessity, even though she had healed many people, as my father pastor had told him, including some terminal cancer patients. She snapped a picture of each of my father's pupils, then enlarged them on a computer screen. Leaning in, she examined the whites of his eyes on the screen. "You need plenty of vitamins," she pointed out to some tiny spots to prove it. "You need to cleanse your system and unblock those lungs." When she was done with him, she handed my father a printout listing some syrups and pills she offered for sale. After my own eye scan, she told me I had an imbalance in my uterus. Had I ever missed any periods? Had I taken a pregnancy test? My father, who'd been examining a catalog filled with pricey herbs, suddenly looked up. "I have no reason to take a pregnancy test," I told her. "My husband and I, well, we're not trying." My father opened his mouth to say something, but his words dissolved into a long coughing spell, which led her to add a few more recommended items to his list. "Something's going on with you," she told me, as we left with $200 worth of vitamins, coenzymes, liquid oxygen, and natural cough suppressants for my father. "The eyes don't lie." Dr. Padman's office was a sad and desperate place. Everyone in his waiting room, mostly Caribbean, African, Eastern European immigrants, seemed to be struggling for breath. Some, like my father, were barely managing on their own, while others dragged mobile oxygen tanks behind them. My brother Bob, who taught global studies at a nearby high school, was, because of his location and the free afternoons his work schedule allowed, my father's most frequent waiting room companion. After a few visits, however, he too began dreading that gray and dingy room, its stale and stuffy smells, its peeling beige paint and anti-smoking posters, because it was the one place where our father's predicament was most unambiguous, where his future seemed most uncertain. At the same time, it was where Papa appeared most comfortable, where he could cough without being embarrassed, because others were coughing too, some even more vociferously. In the skeletal faces and winded voices around him, he could place himself on some kind of continuum, one where he was still coming out ahead. A nurse asked my father to step on a scale soon after we arrived. This was the part of the visits he would come to dread most, for it offered proof that he was indeed shrinking. Before he became ill, he had carried 170 pounds on his 5'11" frame. During that July 2004 visit, he weighed 128 pounds. When we stepped into his office, Dr. Padman quickly introduced himself. A short, bespectacled South Asian man with only a trace of an accent, he seemed, like my father and me, to have spent part of his life in a section of the world that still echoed in his voice. With the examining table and a full-size scale filling up the tiny room, there was space for only one seat across from his desk, where a computer screen was angled toward a barred window away from the patient. I stood behind my father's chair and looked down at both him and the doctor, like a workplace inspector taking everything in while doing her best not to interfere. "How are you doing, sir?" Dr. Padman asked. "Not so good," my father answered. Throughout his illness, my father never told his doctors he was feeling bad. It was either not so good or not so bad, a literal translation of the Creole expression, "papi mal." "And how is the cough, sir?" Dr. Padman continued. My father replied, "The same." I wondered whether Dr. Padman's calling my father sir was an affectation, a point of effort in his bedside or desk-side manner, or something he did naturally. Maybe he was one of those people who called everyone sir, especially those who were least likely to be addressed that way. Or maybe it was simply a way of not having to remember names. Dr. Padman quickly scanned the computer screen, then pulled my father's x-rays and CAT scan film out of a mustard yellow envelope. He held them up to the window light, then glancing at the computer screen, asked my father, "Are you still on the codeine, sir?" My father had stopped taking the codeine, which an emergency room physician had prescribed for him, because the codeine had caused him to fail the yearly drug test required by the Taxi and Limousine Commission for the renewal of his cab driver's license. He took advantage of Dr. Padman's question to ask if Dr. Padman would write a letter for his taxi and limousine commission appeal, stating that he was taking the codeine for legitimate medicinal purposes. Dr. Padman nodded and made a note on a yellow pad. Then he picked up the phone and buzzed his assistant. Edie was a skinny, perky Filipina who spoke every sentence at the top of her voice, as though it were being broadcast through a bullhorn at a pep rally. "Good afternoon," she bellowed, startling my father. "Edie's going to check your breathing, sir," Dr. Padman told my father. My father looked up at Edie, then back at the doctor with equal helplessness. He slowly pushed himself up by holding the back of the chair. "We won't be long," Edie said, grabbing a hold of my father's elbows. As my father disappeared from view, I slipped into the chair where he had been sitting and tried to sneak a look at Dr. Padman's computer. But the tilt of his screen was designed to give maximum view to the doctor and limited view to the patient. "Edie is going to do a pulmonary function test," he explained. "The test will require your father to blow into a tube so we can find out how much air is in the lungs." I imagined my father with this tube in his mouth, trying to fill it impossibly with air and failing over and over again. One did not have to be a pulmonologist to see that he couldn't even blow out a small candle. He had no air to spare. "I'm really worried about my father," I said. Perhaps thinking I was talking only about the test, he said, "Don't worry, Edie will take good care of him." In general, I said, "I'm worried about his condition." "Your father has a very bad disease," he said. "It's called pulmonary fibrosis. You can look it up on the internet. You'll see, it's not very good." Suddenly, it was as though we were discussing someone both of us barely knew. I almost expected him to go home and look up the disease and find my father's name listed under its many definitions and examples. With no better choices of words, deeds, or prayers, I resorted to a cliché, a common line from soap opera sick rooms. "What's his prognosis?" I asked. "It depends on a lot of things," he said, "but most people who are resistant to treatment live anywhere from 6 months to 2 years. My father's body was resisting treatment. The codeine and prednisone he'd been prescribed by the emergency room physician were neither relieving his cough nor slowing down the gradually irreversible stiffening and scarring of his lungs. You should tell your loved ones about your father's condition, Dr. Padman said, as though this was the kind of information one could keep to oneself. Was this the standard way to tell a family member, without the patient's permission, that the patient was dying? Perhaps he didn't want to add to my father's stress by telling him directly that his disease was incurable. Later, however, he would plainly write it in his letter for my father's appeal to the Taxi and Limousine Commission. My patient, Edwidge Danticat, suffers from an incurable condition for which he is required to take codeine. My father never discussed the letter, either before or after he Xeroxed it and sent the original to the Taxi and Limousine Commission, which denied his appeal. What causes an illness like this? I wondered as Dr. Padman and I waited for my father to return from his pulmonary function test. Could it be the persistent car fumes from the 25-plus years my father had worked as a cab driver? Carcinogens from the 20-plus years he smoked as a young man, even though he hadn't smoked in more than 25 years. What about a lung transplant? I asked Dr. Padman. Could my father have a lung transplant? He's 69 years old, he said, as though this too was news to me. I'm afraid he's past the age where we'd put him on the list. Besides, the transplant is no guarantee. There's a very high probability of rejection. Can he have surgery to cut out the bad part of the lung and leave the rest? I asked. Both lungs, in their entirety, are scarred. I was beginning to feel that whatever I told him would be countered by some unworkable obstruction. I heard my father's shoes dragging across the floor, heading back toward us. I'd come to recognize the sound of his loafers, since he'd stopped lifting his feet while walking to alleviate the pressure of literally having to carry his own weight. Edie was standing behind him when he appeared in the doorway, her shoulders drooping. She momentarily seemed as breathless as my father, who had been unable to get through the test. Each time she asked him to breathe into the tube, she reported, he would nearly collapse from coughing. In the past 2 months or so, when my father stood for too long, his body would shake as though he might suddenly fall over. His body was shaking now. I got up and helped him into the chair across from the doctor, whom I expected to begin talking again, explaining my father's condition to him. Surely he had only been practicing on me, and was going to also tell my father how bad the disease was and how many months he might have left to live. He didn't. Instead, he prescribed more prednisone and codeine. My father didn't say anything. He pushed his head back against the wall, closed his eyes, and tried to take deep breaths, which came out as gasps. Going down in the hospital elevator, still not fully understanding all that had taken place, I kept my eyes on the flashing numbers and avoided looking at my father, who even before he was sick, had always been uneasy in unfamiliar surroundings. Now he seemed even more apprehensive, lost in the isolated world of the unwell. In the car, I broached again the very first question Dr. Padman had posed to him. "How do you feel, Papa?" I asked in Creole. Qui j'en wa senti wa. Nula, he said, not bad. Okay, even. Not by usual standards, but what he'd come to consider okay. Not coughing too much, not breathing too hard. Driving was fine because he was not exerting too much energy, but walking was difficult. Walking was hell. "I'm going to drop you off. I'll be home a little bit later," he said, as we approached his and my mother's house, a 4-bedroom, 2-story brick single family they'd purchased 18 years ago after living in a series of small apartments all over Brooklyn. "Come home and rest," I said. He had a meeting at the car service business he ran with my Uncle Frank, the younger of his 2 brothers, and the only one of his 4 surviving siblings living in the United States. My stomach was cramping again so hard and so frequently that I wondered if perhaps the herbalist might be right after all. Was something going on with me? I asked my father to drop me off at a nearby pharmacy where I picked up a pregnancy test. My mother wasn't home when I got there, so I locked myself in my parents' tiny guest bathroom and let a stream of urine run over the 2 plastic sticks in the package. The frosted glass on the bathroom window kept out the afternoon light, and the small space, crowded with my mother's vases of dried roses and potpourri bowls, seemed dark, even with the light on. I squinted to examine the results. 1 pink line popped up, then 2. I examined the box again to make sure I was interpreting correctly. 1 line meant not pregnant, 2 meant pregnant, a symbolism that of course made sense. Before the results, one believed oneself to be 1. Then suddenly, 1 was 2. I leaned against the sink, grabbing a hold of the faucet so I could remain on my feet. My father was dying, and I was pregnant. Both struck me as impossibly unreal. Cradling the now wet plastic wand, I slipped to the floor and sobbed. I was afraid of losing my father, and also struck with a different kind of fear, baby panic. Everything was suddenly mixed up in my head and leading me to the darkest places. Would I carry to full term? Would there be complications? Would I die? Would the baby die? Would the baby and I both die? Would my father die before we died? Or would we all die at the same time? On the other hand, bringing the child into the world seemed to be about anything but death. It was a huge leap of faith in the future, an acknowledgement that one would somehow continue to exist. I had to speak to my husband. I blindly searched my purse for my cell phone and dialed his number. "Guess what?" I blurted out. "We're pregnant." Under different circumstances, I might have rushed back home, greeting him at the airport with an armful of roses addressed to Daddy. Or I might have teased him on the phone, forcing him to pry the news out of me. But there was no way to do it on this particular day. Still, I held back from telling him about my father. Perhaps I didn't want to hear myself say it, or maybe I didn't want to dampen his excitement, to have these 2 pieces of news abruptly collide for him as they had for me. "A baby! How wonderful is that?" My husband was cheering loudly. I could imagine his calm, reassuring smile, broader with delight. "I can't believe it," he shouted, after it had sunk in a bit longer. "We're going to be parents." Aside from my husband, I decided, I would tell no one about the baby for a few days, not even my parents. That weekend, my brother Kelly, a musician and computer programmer, who out of all of us most resembled my father, was coming for a visit from his home in Lancaster, Massachusetts. We all needed to concentrate on a family strategy to deal with my father's diagnosis, and we were not going to come up with one if everyone was distracted by the baby. Besides, I could fully keep both realities in mind at the same time. I couldn't find the words to express both events. I closed my eyes and held my breath, forcing myself to recite it as a mantra. My father is dying, and I am pregnant. I stepped out of the bathroom and called my youngest brother Carl at the brokerage house where he works. I told him that what Dr. Padman had said, and immediately a debate emerged. Should the doctor have told me about our father's prognosis and not have told our father? It was inconsiderate at best, Carl thought, and maybe even unethical. It seems odd. He sounded infuriated at me, at the doctor, at the diagnosis, at the disease. The doctor has no right to share information with you that he's withholding from Dad. Maybe I shouldn't have called him at work, I thought. I should have waited until he got home. There was always so much happening in his office. People were always peeking in. His phone was always ringing. He was probably under pressure. I sprung this on him out of nowhere, told him too quickly, and he had no choice but to respond from the gut, unfiltered. Of the four of us, my brother Carl and Bob, who lived only a few blocks away from my parents' house in East Flatbush, saw my father most often. They, more than anyone except maybe my mother, were going to have to watch him die. Are you going to tell Dad what the doctor said? Carl asked, his voice firm, terse. No, I said, equally unyielding. I hadn't decided until that moment that I wouldn't have that conversation with my father. Maybe Carl or my other brothers could, or even my mother would, but I knew I wouldn't be able to do it. I now found myself rallying to Dr. Padman's side. What would be the use of telling Dad? He would probably become disheartened, heartbroken, depressed. On the other hand, he was a religious man. Maybe he would refute his prognosis outright, call it a lie, and not believe it at all. Still, I didn't think I'd be able to tell him. Maybe it was cowardly, but I couldn't. We should tell Dad what the doctor said, Carl insisted. He should have been told. He had the right to know. Wouldn't you want to know? Of course I'd want to know, I agreed with him in principle. But suddenly I wondered, if my father ever found out how some other way, would he interpret both the doctor's and my not telling him as a sign that things were even more dismal than they actually were? That afternoon, before my father came home, as my mother prepared his supper, I told her a milder version of what Dr. Padman had told me. The doctor doesn't think he's doing well, I said, as she cut up a small squash and slipped pieces into a pot of boiling water to make a stew. The doctor says he might not recover. I kept needlessly repeating the word doctor as if to stress that I was the messenger and not the source. Securing the lid on the pot, my mother turned off the burners on the stove, poured herself a glass of water from the leaky faucet over the sink, and sat down across from me at the bare kitchen table. I knew it was something bad, she said, massaging the sides of her round face with her fingers. Her voice was soft, slow, almost a whisper. He just seems to be melting away. What she cooked that night was a much simpler version of what she originally intended, a thin pumpkin soup rather than a full stew. The soup remaining untouched, however, none of us felt like eating. A few days later, at my father's church, Deacon Association hosted its yearly anniversary brunch at an all-you-can-eat Chinese buffet restaurant on Ralph Avenue in Canarsie, Brooklyn. My father's ivory suit was so big on him that as he put it on that morning, he'd added 2 more holes to his belt, which, overstretched, looked like scarred skin. Dragging his gaunt frame between the tables to greet dozens of longtime friends, he seemed buoyant and jovial, but after each handshake and brief chat, he had to lay his hand on someone's shoulder to rest. When he was done with his round of greetings, he filled a plate with fried chicken wings he never touched. As he coughed, some of the church members came over and held his hand. Others urged him to go home. They might have meant well, but he felt rejected, as if they didn't want him near their food. That same afternoon, my brother Kelly arrived from Massachusetts, so my father decided to hold a family meeting. That meeting, like all of my father's rare previous summits, was a rather formal affair, as we all sat around my parents' long oak dining room table, framed by my mother's ornately carved, antique-looking but brand-new china, and enlarged photographs of our school graduations, weddings, and Christmases. My father went directly to the matter at hand. "The reason for this gathering," he announced, "is to discuss what is going to happen to your mother after I'm gone." My father was sitting in his usual seat at the head of the table. My mother was on the other end, facing him. I was sitting on his left, her right, with Carl, who at 6'1" towered over all of us. Kelly and Bob, the middle children as I like to call them, were sitting across from us. We were all stunned into silence by my father's pronouncement, both those among us who thought we should recount to him what the doctor had said, brothers Carl and Kelly, and most of us who did not, and the rest of us who did not. But maybe the doctor was the wisest of any of us. Of course the patient always knows. My father must have suspected even before the doctor had. After all, he inhabited the body that was failing. "I'm not getting better." My father covered his face with his hands, then slowly pulled them apart as though he were opening a book. "And when a person's sick, either you're getting better or you're dying." He said this so casually and with so little sorrow that my sadness was momentarily lifted. "What would you like to happen after I'm gone?" he asked, looking directly at my mother. "Do you want to stay in the house or sell it and buy an apartment?" "I'm not going anywhere," my mother said defiantly. A line of sweat was growing over her lips as she spoke. I appreciated her unwillingness to embark for such an unknown world, to look toward another life beyond her husband's. The house might be too big for you to live in by yourself. My father continued matter-of-factly, "Someone would have to move in with you." I kept my eyes on the sheer plastic sheath that covered my mother's hibiscus-embroidered tablecloth. Was my father trying to prepare us, put us at ease, show us that we shouldn't worry about him, or was he trying to tell us that he was ready for whatever lay ahead? "Pop!" Bob rubbed his eyes with his balled fist, then raised his hands to catch my father's attention. While I had been staring at the tablecloth, he'd been crying. "Pop, can I ask you a question?" The tears were flowing down Bob's face. He was easily the huskiest and the most overtly emotional of my three brothers, Carl being the most level-headed and Kelly the most reserved. "What is your question?" my father asked, his own eyes growing moist, though he was doing his best to hold back his tears. "Have you enjoyed your life?" Bob asked, pausing after each word as if to take in its weight and meaning. I lowered my head again, absorbing the stillness that also followed this question, the kind of hush that suddenly forces you to pay attention to so many unrelated things around you. The shell of the dead fly trapped in the window screen, the handprints on the plastic cover of the tablecloth, the ticking of a giant clock in the next room, the pressing desire for anything, including an explosion, to burst forth and disrupt the calm. "I don't know what to say about that." My father drew in his breath, something that required a great deal of effort and thus resulted in grimace-like contortion of his face. I can't remember every moment. But what I can say is this. I haven't enjoyed myself in the sense of party and glory. I haven't seen a lot of places and haven't done that many things, but I've had a good life. My father went on to list what he considered his greatest accomplishments: Kelly, Carl, Bob, and me, as well as his three grandchildren, Carl's 5-year-old son Ezekiel and 2-year-old daughter Zora, and Bob's 5-year-old daughter Nadira. "You, my children, have not shamed me," he continued. "I'm proud of that. It could have been so different. Edwidge and Bob, your mother and I left you behind for 8 years in Haiti. Kelly and Carl, you grew up here in a country your mother and I didn't know very well when we had you. You all could have turned bad, but you didn't. I thank God for that. I thank God for all of you. I thank God for your mother." Then turning his eyes back to Bob, he added, "Yes, you can say I have enjoyed my life." Listening to my father, I remembered a time when I used to dream of smuggling him words. I was 8 years old, and Bob and I were living in Haiti with his oldest brother, my Uncle Joseph, and his wife. And since they didn't have a telephone at home, few Haitian families did then, and access to the call centers was costly, we had no choice but to write letters. Every other month my father would mail a half-page, 3-paragraph missive addressed to my uncle, scribbled in his minuscule scrawl, sometimes on plain white paper, other times on lined, hole-punched notebook pages, still showing bits of fringe from the spiral binding. My father's letters were composed in stilted French, with the first paragraph offering news of his and my mother's health, the second detailing how to spend the money they had wired for food, lodging, and school expenses for Bob and myself, the third section concluding abruptly after reassuring us that we'd be hearing from him again before long. Later I would discover in a first-year college composition class that his letters had been written in a diamond sequence, the Aristotelian poetics of correspondence, requiring an opening greeting, a middle detail of request, and a brief farewell at the end. The letter-writing process had been such an agonizing chore for my father, one that he'd hurried through while assembling our survival money, that this specific epistolary formula, which he followed unconsciously, had offered him a comforting way of disciplining his emotions. "I was no writer," he later told me. "What I wanted to tell you and your brother was too big for any piece of paper and a small envelope." Whatever restraint my father showed us in his letters was easily compensated for by Uncle Joseph's reactions to them. First, there was the public reading in my uncle's sparsely furnished pink living room in front of Tante Denise, Bob, and me. This was done so there would be no misunderstanding as to how the money my parents sent for me and my brother would be spent. Usually my uncle would read the letters out loud, pausing now and then to ask my help with my father's penmanship, a kindness, I thought, a way to include me in a step further. It soon became obvious, however, that my father's handwriting was as clear to me as my own, so I eventually acquired the job of deciphering his letters. Along with this task came a few minutes of preparation for the reading, and thus a few intimate moments with my father's letters, not only the words and phrases, which did not vary greatly from month to month, but the vowels and syllables, their tilts and slants, which did. Because he wrote so little, I would try to guess his thoughts and moods, from the dotting of his I's and the crossing of his T's, from whether there were actual periods at the ends of his sentences or just faint dots where the tip of his pen had simply landed. Did commas split his streamlined phrases, or were they staccato, like someone speaking too rapidly out of breath? For the family readings, I recited my father's letters in a monotone, honoring what I interpreted as a secret between us, that the impersonal style of his letters was due as much to his lack of faith in words and their ability to accurately reproduce his emotions, as to his caution with Bob's and my feelings, avoiding too happy news that might add to the anguish of separation, too sad news that might worry us, and any hint of judgment or disapproval from my aunt and uncle, which they could have interpreted as suggestions that they were mistreating us. The dispassionate letters were his way of avoiding a minefield, when he could have set off from a distance without being able to comfort the victims. Given all this anxiety, I'm amazed my father wrote it all. The regularity, the consistency of his correspondence now feels like an act of valor. In contrast, my replies, though less routine, Uncle Joseph did most of the writing, were both painstakingly upbeat and suppliant. In my letters, I bragged about my good grades and requested as a reward for them an American doll at Christmas, a typewriter or sewing machine for my birthday, a pair of real gold earrings for Easter. But the things I truly wanted I was afraid to ask for. Like when would I finally see him and my mother again? However, since my uncle read and corrected all my letters for faulty grammar and spelling, I wrote for his eyes more than for my father's, hoping that even after vigorous editing, my father could still decode the longing in my childish cursive slopes and arches, which were so much like his own. The words that both my father and I wanted to exchange we never did. These letters were not approved, in his case by him, in my case by my uncle. No matter what the reason, we have always been equally paralyzed by the fear of breaking each other's heart. This is why I could never ask the question Bob did. I also could never tell my father what I'd learned from the doctor that he was dying. Even when they mattered less, there were things he and I were too afraid to say. A few days after the family meeting, my father called my Uncle Joseph in Haiti to see how he was doing. It was Thursday, July 15th, 2004, the 51st birthday of Jean-Bertrand Aristide, Haiti's twice elected and twice deposed president. Having been removed from power in February 2004 through a joint political action by France, Canada, and the United States, Aristide was now spending his birthday in exile in South Africa. However, the residents of Bel Air, the neighborhood where I grew up and where my Uncle Joseph still lived, had not forgotten him. Joining other Aristide supporters, they'd marched, nearly 3,000 of them, through the Haitian capital to call for his return. The march had been mostly peaceful, except that, according to the television news reports that my father and I watched together that evening, 2 policemen had been shot. My father called my uncle just as he always did whenever something like this was happening in Haiti. He was sitting up in bed, his head propped on 2 firm pillows, his face angled toward the bedroom window, which allowed him a slanted view of a neighborhood street lamp. "Are you sure he's sleeping?" my father asked whoever had answered the phone at my uncle's house in Bel Air. My father cupped the phone with one hand, pushed his face toward me, and whispered, "Maxo." I gathered he was talking to Uncle Joseph's son, Maxo, who had left Haiti in the early 1970s to attend college in New York, then had returned in 1995. Though I had spent most of my childhood with Maxo's son, Nick, I did not know Maxo as well. "Don't you think it's time your father moved out of Bel Air?" my father asked Maxo. As he hung up, he seemed disappointed that he hadn't been able to speak to Uncle Joseph. Over the years, this had been a touchy subject between my father and uncle, my father wanting my uncle to move to any other part of Haiti, and my uncle refusing to even consider it. I now imagined my father longing to tell his brother to leave Bel Air, but this time not for the reasons he usually offered, the constant demonstrations, the police raids, and gang wars that caused him to constantly worry, but because my father was dying and he wanted his oldest brother to be safe. I write these things now, some as I witnessed them and today remember them, others from official documents, as well as the borrowed recollections of family members. But the gist of them was told to me over the years, in part by my Uncle Joseph, in part by my father. Some were told offhand, quickly, others in greater detail. What I learned from my father and uncle, I learned out of sequence and in fragments. This is an attempt at cohesiveness and at recreating a few wondrous and terrible months when their lives and mine intersected in startling ways, forcing me to look forward and back at the same time. I am writing this only because they can't. The end of Chapter 1.